The winter of 1886 came down on the Dakota Territory like a hammer. It was a cold that was not merely an absence of heat, but a tangible presence, an invading force that sought out every chink, every crack, every seam in the flimsy armor of civilization. It moved across the endless plains not like a blanket, but like a thief, stealing the warmth from a man's bones and the life from his livestock. The prairie grass, brittle as glass, shattered underfoot. The sky, a vast and indifferent expanse of pale blue, offered no comfort, only the promise of more wind, more ice, more nights where the howl of the gale sounded like a predator circling the fragile sod houses. The settlers of the small, unnamed community scattered near the James River knew the cold. They had faced it before. They were people of grit and resolve, hardened by previous seasons of hardship. But this year felt different. The cold arrived earlier and with a more vicious bite. It was a deeper, more profound cold, one that seemed to sink into the very earth and stay there, a permanent frost that defied the weak winter sun. Their homes, called sadis, were monuments to their tenacity, but were proving to be miserable failures in the face of this new assault. They were built from the earth itself, bricks of prairie turf stacked to form thick walls, but they were porous to the wind and bled heat like a sieve. Inside these dwellings, life was a constant losing battle. Frost grew on the interior walls, intricate crystalline patterns that were beautiful and deadly. Drafts slithered across the floorboards like invisible snakes, coiling around ankles and chilling children as they slept. The potbelly stoves, glowing a furious cherry red, consumed wood and coal at an astonishing rate. Yet their heat seemed to radiate only a few feet before being swallowed by the immense cold that pressed in from all sides. Families huddled together under piles of quilts and animal hides, their breath pluming in the air of their own homes. The men spent their days chopping wood, their axes ringing against the frozen timber, and their nights feeding the insatiable fires, knowing that their fuel piles were shrinking far too fast. It was a universal struggle, a shared misery that bound the community together. They spoke of the cold in hushed, grim tones, sharing stories of frozen wells and livestock lost to the night. They offered each other what little help they could, a share of firewood, a bit of advice on chinking cracks with mud and straw. But everyone knew these were temporary measures, like patching a sinking ship with rags. They were all in the same boat, and the ice was closing in. The traditional methods, the wisdom passed down from those who had settled these plains a decade earlier, were no longer enough. The hammer of winter was falling, and their homes, built with pride and sweat, were beginning to crack. Amidst this community of shared struggle lived Ilara, a woman set apart by her silence and her sorrow. She was a widow, her husband, Franz, having been taken by pneumonia the previous winter, a victim of the very same cold that now threatened them all. He had died in their standard-built sadi, his labored breaths turning to frost in the air of the room. Ilara had come with him from the Swiss Alps, a world of towering mountains and deep, secluded valleys, a place where people had learned over centuries to coexist with a different, but equally unforgiving kind of cold. She was seen as an outsider, her quiet nature mistaken for aloofness, her accent a subtle barrier. The other women tried to include her, but her grief was a wall around her, and her ways were not their ways. She was a woman who observed. She watched the prairie dogs, how they disappeared deep into the earth to escape the wind and the frost. She noted how the snow would drift against the low hills, creating an insulating blanket. She remembered the deep stone cellars of her childhood home, places that were cool in the summer, but remained above freezing in the deepest winter, protected by the great, unmoving mass of the earth. Her knowledge was not the frontier knowledge of her neighbors. It was older, rooted in a different landscape and a different understanding of survival. And in the worn pages of a German book on agrarian architecture, she had carried across the ocean. She saw drawings of semi-subterranean dwellings from cold climates around the world, structures that used the earth itself as a shield. One brisk morning in late autumn, when the first true bite of the coming winter was in the air, the community noticed Ilara doing something strange. She was not reinforcing her sadi or stockpiling more wood. Instead, she was in the flat, open space behind her home, with 2 long pieces of twine and 4 wooden stakes. She marked out a large rectangle on the frozen ground, a space far larger than a grave, but with a similar finality. Then, she picked up a shovel and a heavy iron pick, and she began to dig. She did not ask for help, and no one offered it. They watched from a distance, puzzled, as the quiet widow began to carve a hole in the prairie. The idea, when it became clear, was met with ridicule. Thomas, the community's most respected builder, a large, confident man whose own sadi was considered the finest in the settlement, was the first to approach her. He stood at the edge of the growing pit, his hands on his hips, a look of profound disbelief on his face. "Woman," he said, his voice carrying on the wind, not unkindly, but with the unshakable certainty of an expert. "What are you doing? You can't live in a hole. The damp will get in. The frost heaves the ground. You'll be buried alive or freeze in a puddle of mud." Ilara paused, leaning on her shovel, her breath a white cloud in the air. Her 2 small children, Leo and Sophia, were nearby, gathering the loose dirt into a small wagon. "The earth is warm," she said simply, her accent making the words sound strange and foreign. "The wind is cold. I will live in the warmth and let the wind pass over." Thomas let out a short, sharp laugh. A few other men who had gathered behind him chuckled as well. "The earth is warm?" Thomas repeated, shaking his head. "The ground is frozen solid 2 feet down. We build up, away from the frost, on foundations. That is the proper way. That is how we stay dry and safe." He pointed toward her existing sadi. "You'd be better off chinking the walls of your own house than digging a grave for you and your children." The mockery was not malicious, not in their minds. It was the practical, common-sense reaction of people who knew the rules of survival in this place. They saw her project as a folly, a foolish whim born of grief and ignorance. They called it Ilara's folly, or the sleeping pit. The children in the settlement whispered that she was digging a home for prairie dogs. The laughter followed her as she worked, a constant, demoralizing chorus of doubt. But Ilara did not stop. She had felt the cold steal the life from her husband in a house built the proper way. She would not let it take her children. Her motivation was not an abstract theory. It was the memory of a death rattle in a frozen room, and the sight of her children shivering in their sleep. So she ignored the warnings and the laughter, and she kept digging. The work was a relentless, grueling ordeal. The topsoil was frozen solid, a thick, unyielding crust that had to be shattered with the heavy pick before it could be shoveled away. Each swing sent a jarring shock up her arms and into her shoulders. Her progress was measured in inches, each one earned through sweat and sheer force of will. The men of the settlement, passing by on their way to chop wood, would watch her for a few moments, shake their heads, and walk on, secure in their knowledge that her efforts were doomed to fail. They saw a lone woman engaged in a pointless, back-breaking task. They did not see the quiet, methodical precision that guided her every move. As she dug deeper, past the frost line, the earth softened. The soil changed from black topsoil to dense brown clay. The digging became easier, but the labor of hauling the dirt out of the deepening pit grew harder. She fashioned a simple ramp and used her children's small wagon, pulling it up with a rope, load after painstaking load. Leo and Sophia, though young, understood the gravity of their mother's work. They did not complain. They helped pile the excavated earth into long, high berms on the north and west sides of the pit, the direction from which the winter winds blew their fiercest. Elara was not just digging a hole. She was sculpting the land around it, creating an additional shield against the coming storm. While Elara worked with patient diligence, the rest of the community engaged in a flurry of frantic, traditional preparation. Thomas led work parties, mixing huge batches of mud and straw to plaster into the cracks of the soddies. It was a temporary fix, and they all knew it. The freezing and thawing cycles would shrink the mud, and the first strong wind would blow it out. But it was what they had always done. They stacked enormous piles of firewood and coal, a visual representation of their anxieties. The higher the stack, the safer they felt, yet a nagging doubt lingered. They were preparing to fight the winter head-on, to battle it with fire and fortification. Elara, in her quiet way, was preparing to hide from it. Her work was a study in detail. Once the pit was dug to a depth of nearly 8 feet, she began to line the walls. She did not leave the bare earth exposed, as her critics had assumed. She used flat fieldstones, hauled one by one from the riverbed, to create a sturdy, dry-stacked retaining wall for the lower portion. Above that, she cut bricks of sod with a near-perfect precision, fitting them so tightly together that no gaps remained. She was not just building a shelter, she was engineering a thermal battery. The dense, compacted earth of the walls and floor was meant to absorb and hold a steady, low-level heat, a principle she had read about in her book and understood intuitively from the stone houses of her homeland. The roof was the most critical part of the design. She used scavenged timbers to create a low-pitched A-frame, barely rising 3 feet above ground level at its peak. This was no tall, proud roof meant to shed snow, but a low, humble structure designed to welcome it. She laid thick planks over the rafters, and on top of that she placed a layer of precious tar paper she had traded for, creating a waterproof membrane. Then came a thick layer of dried prairie grass for insulation, and finally she covered the entire structure with the same thick, insulating sod bricks, layering them 2 deep. The entrance was not a simple door, but a long, angled trench, also covered, that descended into the living space. This design acted as a cold trap, preventing the frigid outside air from rushing directly into the dwelling every time the door was opened. Inside, the space was simple and functional. A small, efficient stove was placed near the center, its pipe rising through a carefully insulated opening in the roof. The floor was packed earth, covered with wooden planks in the sleeping area. She built low beds into the earthen walls, creating cozy alcoves for the children. The air inside the pit was still and silent, the roar of the prairie wind already muted, though the structure was not yet fully sealed. It was a cocoon of earth and sod, a pocket of calm carved out of the harsh, wind-swept plains. Her neighbors saw a hole in the ground. Elara saw a sanctuary. By the time the first real snows of December began to fall, Elara and her children had moved into the sleeping pit. The old soddy stood empty, a hollow monument to a failed idea. The community's judgment was swift and harsh. They saw it as the final act of a woman lost to grief. They pitied the children, forced to live underground like animals. But as the temperature continued to drop, a subtle shift began. The smoke rising from the chimneys of the soddies was a thick, constant plume, a sign of fires burning hot and fast. The smoke from Elara's stovepipe, however, was a thin, lazy wisp, a mere suggestion of a fire burning low and steady. It was a detail most failed to notice, but it was the quiet harbinger of the vindication to come. The great storm arrived in the second week of January. It did not come with the fury of a sudden squall, but with a slow, menacing certainty. The sky turned the color of lead, a heavy, oppressive ceiling that seemed to lower itself onto the plains. The wind began to rise, not in gusts, but as a steady, building pressure, a relentless river of Arctic air flowing down from the north. The temperature, which had been hovering near zero, began a terrifying descent, 10 below, 20 below. By nightfall, it was 30 below zero, and the wind had risen to a constant, screaming gale, picking up the loose snow and turning the world into a churning vortex of white. The settlers called it a blizzard, but it was more than that. It was a white hurricane, a storm of historic proportions. For the families and their sadis, the first night was a nightmare of cold and fear. The wind, now gusting to speeds that vibrated the very walls of their homes, was a physical force of incredible power. It scoured the mud chinking from between the sod bricks as if it were sand. Fine, granular snow began to spray through the walls, coating everything in a layer of icy dust. The drafts were no longer like snakes, but like knives, sharp and cutting. The stoves, fed with a frantic desperation, burned through a week's worth of wood in a single night, yet the heat they produced was immediately stolen by the wind. The interiors of the cabins grew dangerously cold. Water froze solid just a few feet from the roaring fires. Thomas, the proud builder, found his expertise was worthless against such an onslaught. He and his wife Sarah spent the night stuffing rags and spare clothes into the growing cracks in their walls. But it was a futile effort. The wind found every weakness, exploiting it with a savage intelligence. The roar of the gale was so loud they had to shout to be heard. Their young son, Daniel, huddled by the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned, was shivering uncontrollably, his lips tinged with blue. Thomas looked at the beautiful, strong house he had built, the symbol of his status in the community, and saw it for what it was: a fragile shell being torn apart by the storm. He felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was failing his family. He was wrong. Meanwhile, 8 feet below the surface of the raging blizzard, a profound and steady quiet reigned. In Ilara's sleeping pit, the storm was a distant, muffled roar, a beast raging somewhere far above them. The wind could not touch them. It screamed over the low, snow-covered roof, the drifts it created only adding to the layers of insulation. The earthen walls, protected from the wind and the extreme air temperature, radiated a gentle, constant coolness, not the biting frost of an exposed surface. The ground temperature, a stable 40 degrees, provided a massive thermal buffer. The small stove required only a few logs every few hours to keep the interior at a comfortable, even 60 degrees. The air was still. There were no drafts. Ilara sat calmly, mending a tear in Leo's trousers by the light of a kerosene lamp. Her children were not huddled and shivering. They were asleep in their earthen alcoves, under a single quilt each, their breathing deep and peaceful. The contrast with the world above was absolute. Up there was a battle for survival, a chaotic struggle against an overwhelming force. Down here was a sanctuary of warmth and peace. Ilara's creation was being tested by the worst the Dakota winter could offer, and it was holding. Her foolish idea, her eccentric pit, worked. The storm raged for 2 days and 2 nights without pause. The temperature dropped to an almost unbelievable 50 degrees below zero, a cold so extreme it could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The wind never let up, whipping the snow into impenetrable whiteouts. In the settlement, the situation grew desperate. One family's roof began to buckle under the weight of a massive snowdrift. Another ran out of firewood completely and began to burn their furniture to stay alive. The sounds of crying children and the grim, fearful silence of adults filled the failing sadis. The community was breaking. For Thomas, the breaking point came on the second night. The wind had finally torn a significant hole in his western wall, and a steady stream of snow was pouring into his home. The temperature inside had dropped below freezing. His son, Daniel, was now lethargic, his shivering having given way to a dangerous stillness. Sarah looked at him, her face a mask of terror and appeal. "Thomas, we have to do something," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper against the howl of the wind. "He won't survive another night of this." In that moment, all of Thomas's pride, all his certainty in his own knowledge, shattered. There was only one place to go. He had to swallow his pride and face the woman he had mocked. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned and stepped out into the blizzard. The force of the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. The cold was a stunning, physical blow that took his breath away. He could not see more than a few feet in front of him. He tied a rope to his doorknob and, holding onto it, began to fight his way toward Ilara's folly, a journey of less than 100 yards that felt like a mile. The wind tore at him, ice crystals blasted his exposed skin, and the roaring in his ears was deafening. He fell twice, the snow swallowing him, and for a moment he thought he would not get up. But the image of his son's pale face drove him on. He finally stumbled into the berm of excavated earth and found the angled entrance to the pit, a dark slash in the churning white. He fumbled with the simple wooden door and fell inside, tumbling down the short steps into the entryway. He slammed the door shut behind him, cutting off the unholy roar of the storm as if a switch had been thrown. The sudden silence was as shocking as the wind had been. He pushed aside a heavy blanket that served as an inner door and stepped into the main living space. The first thing that hit him was the warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove, but a calm, steady, and even warmth that filled the entire space. It was like stepping into a different season. The second thing was the stillness of the air. The third was the light, a soft, golden glow from a single lamp that illuminated a scene of impossible peace. Ilara was sitting at a small table, reading her book. Leo and Sophia were on the floor, quietly playing with carved wooden animals. They were all in simple shirt sleeves. Thomas stood there, a monstrous figure of ice and snow, his beard a solid mass of frost, his body shaking from the cold and the exertion. He stared, unable to process the scene. He looked at the walls, smooth and solid. He looked at the small, gently burning fire in the stove. He looked at the peacefully sleeping children. He could not reconcile the hell he had just left with the haven he had just entered. He had come to beg for shelter, expecting to find a damp, miserable hole, perhaps a few degrees warmer than his own home. He had found a sanctuary. Ilara looked up from her book. Her face registered no surprise, no triumph, no hint of, "I told you so." Her expression was one of calm, quiet compassion. She did not speak. She simply stood up, walked over to him, and began to gently brush the snow from his coat. She took his frozen mittens from his hands and led him to a stool near the stove. She then poured him a cup of hot broth from a pot simmering on the stovetop and placed it in his trembling hands. It was an act of simple, profound grace. In the face of her quiet competence and her unspoken forgiveness, Thomas felt the last of his pride crumble into dust. He took a sip of the broth, the warmth spreading through his chest, and 2 tears froze on his icy cheeks. He was wrong. He had been so terribly, dangerously wrong. He finally found his voice, a raw, broken whisper. "My son, my family, we're freezing." Ilara simply nodded. "Bring them," she said. Thomas didn't need to be told twice. He drank the rest of the broth, the warmth giving him strength, and made the perilous journey back to his own ruined home. He returned minutes later with Sarah and a bundled Daniel, guiding them through the storm. As Sarah entered the pit, Her reaction was the same as his: stunned disbelief, followed by overwhelming relief. She broke down in tears, clutching her son, as Ilara wrapped the boy in a warm blanket and sat him by the fire. They were not the last to arrive. News of a sort travels even in a blizzard, a desperate sixth sense. The family whose roof had started to fail saw the light from Thomas's lantern on his journey and, choosing to risk the storm over the certainty of a collapse, followed his tracks. They arrived, half-frozen and terrified, to the same scene of warmth and calm. Ilara took them in without question. Before the night was over, 2 more families had made the desperate pilgrimage to the sleeping pit, guided by hope and the primal instinct for survival. Ilara's folly had become the settlement's ark. The small, subterranean space was crowded with 17 souls, a collection of her harshest critics and their children, all of them now silent with awe and gratitude. They huddled together, strangers and neighbors, sharing the life-saving warmth of the home they had ridiculed, while the storm that was destroying their own houses raged harmlessly above. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, the world was transformed. The wind died down to an exhausted sigh, and a weak, pale sun shone on a landscape buried under monumental drifts of snow. The survivors emerged from the pit, blinking in the bright, cold light. The sight that greeted them was one of utter devastation. Their sadis were half buried, their walls breached, their interiors filled with snow. They were frozen, uninhabitable ruins. The proud work of their hands had been obliterated. The only intact, functioning home in the entire settlement was the one they had all dismissed as a mad woman's dream. The laughter had been replaced by a profound, humbling silence. Word of what had happened spread as the settlers began to dig out. Everyone had a story of terror and near disaster, and everyone had heard the story of Ilara's pit, the sanctuary that had saved 1/3 of the community. People walked over to see it for themselves, peering down into the warm, dry space with a sense of wonder. They saw the simple, elegant logic of it now. They saw how the earth protected, how the low profile defeated the wind, how the thick insulation held the heat. What had looked like foolishness before the storm now looked like genius. A few days later, Thomas approached Ilara again. He found her outside, calmly shoveling a path from her door. He stood before her, no longer the confident, condescending expert, but a humbled, desperate man. He held his worn hat in his hands, twisting the brim. "Ilara," he began, his voice thick with emotion, I have never been so wrong in my life. You saved my family. You saved all of us." He looked at the ruins of his own home, then back at her simple, effective dwelling. "I built my house to fight the prairie," he said, a look of revelation on his face. "You built yours to listen to it." He took a deep breath. "I am a builder, or I thought I was, but I don't know anything. Please, teach me." Ilara looked at him, and for the first time, she gave him a small, genuine smile. She did not lecture or gloat. She did not demand an apology or payment. She saw a man whose pride had been stripped away, leaving only a sincere desire to learn. She nodded. "There is much to do before the next winter," she said. And so, the skeptic became the student. Ilara shared her knowledge as freely as she had shared her warmth. She drew diagrams in the snow with a stick, explaining the principles of the cold trap, the thermal mass of the earth, the crucial importance of the insulated, waterproof roof. Thomas, the practical builder, listened with the focus of a man whose life depended on it, asking questions not of doubt, but of clarification. He absorbed every detail, his mind translating her old-world knowledge and book learning into the practical language of timber, sod, and stone. That spring, the settlement did not rebuild. It was reborn. the landscape of the community began to change in a fundamental way. The sound of saws and hammers was replaced by the rhythmic scrape of shovels against earth. Led by Thomas, who was now Elara's most dedicated and vocal advocate, the families began to dig. They worked together, in communal teams, excavating new homes based on Elara's design. They laid foundations deep in the ground, built low-profile roofs, and banked the walls with protective berms of earth. The tall, vulnerable sadis that had been their pride were abandoned, left to crumble back into the prairie. In their place rose a new kind of settlement, a village that hugged the earth, a community of low, grass-covered dwellings that seemed to grow organically from the plains. The transformation was more than just architectural. It was a change in mindset. The settlers learned to see the land not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a partner in survival. They learned the value of humility, the wisdom of observation, and the strength in admitting when the old ways were wrong. Elara, once the quiet outsider, became the respected heart of the community. She was no longer the widow or the eccentric woman who dug holes. She was Elara, the teacher, the innovator, the woman who had listened to the earth when no one else would. She never sought a leadership role, but her quiet wisdom was now the foundation upon which the entire community was built. The story of the settlement that survived the Great Blizzard of '87 by living underground became a piece of prairie legend. Travelers and surveyors passing through would stop and stare at the unusual, hobbit-like village, and they would leave with sketches and stories of the Dakota Pit House. The idea spread, carried by word of mouth and letters to other struggling settlements across the northern plains. It was never a widespread movement, but for a generation of pioneers facing the harshest climates, Elara's quiet revolution offered a new blueprint for survival, a way to find warmth and security, not by building higher, but by digging deeper. Years later, an elderly Elara would sit at the entrance of her warm, comfortable home, watching her grandchildren play in the sunshine. The settlement around her was prosperous and safe, its people secure in their earthen homes, no longer fearing the howl of the winter wind. They had learned the most profound lesson the prairie had to teach, that the loudest, proudest voices are often the most fragile in the face of nature's power. True strength, true wisdom, lies not in defiance, but in understanding. It is found in the quiet patience to observe, the humility to learn, and the courage to trust a new idea, especially one that sleeps peacefully in the warm, steady heart of the earth. The legacy of her work was not just in the sod-covered roofs that dotted the landscape, but in the spirit of the people who lived beneath them. They became a community that valued quiet competence over boastful pride, and thoughtful innovation over blind tradition. They learned that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to dig, to seek shelter in the embrace of the world itself, and to understand that the greatest wisdom is often whispered by the earth to those who are humble enough to listen. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet wisdom and listening to nature, share it with someone who believes in the strength of humble innovation. And follow for more inspiring stories of survival, courage, and ingenuity.